Hello. This morning, my eye was caught by a little patch of dry ground just outside my window here. It had been grass, but there was a big shrub which overshadowed it, and over the course of time, it's died back. And when I cut the shrub back earlier this year, the grass hasn't yet regrown. In fact, it's now parched and cracked and quite ugly. And even though we've had rain over the last couple of days, the rain seems to roll off it and there are no green shoots. And it was drawn to my attention this morning, and I wasn't sure why. Maybe it's because that's how I'm, or that's how you're feeling. Maybe we feel a bit dry and parched and cracked. Maybe we feel that something which has overshadowed us, something which has prevented us from growing, even though it's now no longer there, we still are not thriving. And that's perfectly reasonable. I would like that grass to grow. I would like it to look lush and green like the rest of the grass. But it's not happened yet. And that word yet is the important one. Throughout the Bible, there are stories of times when God's people felt that they were unable to thrive. You may know the story of the two friends who walked away from Jerusalem after Jesus' crucifixion. Feeling deflated and let down, they thought the man was the one to change everything, and yet he was crucified. You may know that in that story, Jesus meets them on the road, although they don't recognise that it's him. And he shares a meal with them and breaks bread, at which point their eyes are opened, which is a way of saying they understood who he was. There are other times in the story of God, recorded in the Bible, when God's people feel rejected or alone. Perhaps they're persecuted, maybe they're in exile, perhaps they're in captivity. But God makes promises over them. And one of them I called to mind this morning is in a book by a prophet. A prophet was someone who foretold what was going to happen. A prophet was someone who often heard from God and was asked to relay God's words to God's people. And this was the role of the prophet Isaiah when God's chosen people were in exile. They'd been captured. They were away from their promised land. And in a way that feels a bit like the times now. We are away from our common practices in everyday life and our common practices as Christians as well. And yet God's book, the Bible, is full of promises of hope. And this particular one came to mind this morning because of the parched and cracked bit of land outside my window. It says, "Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong. Do not fear. Here is your God." Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For waters shall break forth from the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. As I look on my dry and parched and cracked little bit of land, I hold on to those promises of God for those dry and parched and cracked places in my life, in my thinking, in my hoping. And I call to mind the promises of God, the hope that He holds out for all of us, that dry and parched land won't remain cracked and unproductive. That though it may take time, I know that grass will eventually grow back on that bit of ground. I know that God's promises are yes and amen, that they will be fulfilled, that I have a hope in Jesus my Saviour, that at some point I will meet on my journey away from hope into despair with Jesus on the road, who will break bread with me and reveal Himself to me and remind me of the promise of lush and new growth that God has for me and for all who believe in Him. Whatever your situation today, remember the promises of God. Remember the hope that He holds out to us, that the land won't remain dry and parched and cracked, that the burning sand shall become a pool, and waters will break forth in the wilderness. Stay safe.